Hey folks, I thought I'd put together this quick show to talk about week 2, discussion 1, and address this question of what in the world is federalism. So I want to cover here. First off is to talk a little bit more about what federalism means. Secondly, how to go about defining course concepts in the discussion questions. And finally, talk about this PI and APA business, okay? Okay, let's try to take a look at what is federalism. I found this little chart on the internet and thought it would be helpful to explain what's going on here. This is putting together 3 different types of systems side by side, and that's why I chose it. I thought it might be helpful. First off is this unitary system. Okay, and you're going to find this type of system mainly in Europe, okay, or Japan. Under the unitary system, the national government is the only sovereign government. In the states, they're really not state governments. They're more like provincial governments. Now, this is not in every country in Europe. I mean, Great Britain has some differences, and so does the Federal Republic of Germany. But for most part, this is the type of system that you would find in Europe. Now, over here on the right-hand side, you've got this confederation system. And the origin of sovereignty is from the states. Now, this is how we lived during the Revolutionary War when the states declared independence in 1776. They formed what was not really a national government, but they formed a U.S. Congress, which had very little powers. It didn't have any power that they didn't get from the state. Okay, and that's why this arrow is going that way, because they didn't, the states were the source of all political power, and the national government only had what was given to them by the states, which wasn't much. Okay, but we have chosen, let me back up here. In the mid 1780s, it was perceived by some of the leadership in the United States that our system over here, our confederation, wasn't working so hot, and that we needed a reform of our system and give us a stronger central authority. So this is what they came up with in the Constitutional Convention. All right, and so you notice here the sovereignty of the people flows in 2 directions. One to state governments, one to national governments. So we call that dual sovereignty. And this sovereignty is expressed, these arrows are expressed by constitutions. There is one U.S. Constitution, which applies universally across the country. And then there are 50 different state constitutions. And those are, they apply to the citizens in each particular state. And so this is why we call our system federal, because there's a level of sovereignty at the states, and there's a level of sovereignty at the national government. Okay, federal system. Now let me go into our chart here from the textbook. All right, got to erase these first. Kind of cool what you can do with PowerPoint these days. Oop, there we are. Come on, erase. There we go. Okay. So today here's this chart of federalism, and what do we have here? These are the shared powers. I wanted to point out to you first of all. These are generic powers that all governments typically exercise, okay? Borrowing money, punishing criminals, establishing courts, all this kind of stuff are shared. They are not unique to the state or the national government, the federal government. But what we have here is a set of powers that are specifically identified as being national powers. And notice there's no overlap with the states here. They are completely separate. Where do we get these powers? How do we know what goes in this little Venn diagram? It comes out of Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. And this is not the comprehensive list of powers, but it's an example. So in our Constitution, if you go to Article 1 and the 8th section of that article, you'll see all the national powers of the federal government. The states, everything else is reserved to the states. That's the 10th Amendment. That's the last amendment in the Bill of Rights, and it says that all powers that are not delegated to the federal government are reserved to the states or the people. And so this is where you have these are the typical things that states do in our system. All right, so that hopefully gives you a graphical depiction of the concept. What has happened over the years, and this is where the confusion comes in, is the lines have become blurred. If I can, what color should I choose here? The lines here between state and national have become, completely blurred, where now you have, the federal government is intimately involved with K through 12 education. It has a tremendous amount of influence on state commerce. So we saw that the U.S. Supreme Court redefined marriage a few years ago and said, no, states, you don't have the authority to make marriage policy. We're going to do it for you. And the list goes on. There's the federal government is involved in virtually every aspect of our lives, and there's a tremendous amount of overlap between what the federal government does and what the state government does. There's a long history behind that, going back into the 1930s and the Great Depression. The president of the time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and many others who supported him made the case that the national government needed to do more and to address our economic crisis, and the rest really is history. So the federal government is involved in virtually every aspect of our lives, and that is a tension. It continues to be a tension because some argue that the federal government has far overreached its proper authority, and you see states filing lawsuits to push back against national power. And so that's kind of where we are today. So I recognize why it might be a little bit confusing about what federalism really is. But in the beginning, if I may use that phrase, it was not about the federal government and the state governments cooperating with each other to solve problems. It was not about balancing power, or it wasn't even about equality of sovereignty. In the beginning, the national government was never thought to be more than limited to a very few items, and the bulk of the power would stay with the states. So the whole idea was to divide up power so as to respect the sovereignty of the states and the federal government, and to protect liberty. That's the essence of what federalism is all about. In fact, if there were not that division of power, there is no way the Constitution would have been ratified. The states simply would not have surrendered their power to this new national government. It just was not going to happen. It wasn't politically feasible at all. So I hope this helps clarify a little bit about what federalism is and why it's important. It protects liberty and it respects the sovereignty of the states. So here's a real world example of federalism at work that I found today in The Hill. And I got this through Real Clear Politics, which is one of those sources I recommend to you about where do you get your news. And The Hill is kind of a political journal. You can see the kinds of articles that they have here. So if you want to know what inside the Beltway people are reading and talking about this is it. But this story is written by a libertarian. It's an opinion piece, okay? A libertarian is somebody who is very suspicious of government at all levels, but especially the federal government. So um, she has that point of view, and you'll learn more about libertarianism at the end of the course. But anyways, she writes an article about how people from New York are fleeing to Florida when it comes time to retirement because of the tax rate that New York um, imposes on its residents, but not just the tax rate. It's about cost of living. It's about quality of life. Um, and she walks through an example of somebody, a fictional person named U-Haul, David U-Haul, right, who is thinking about where he's going to retire, right? He's 55, he's single, he's healthy, he earns $100,000 a year as an accountant, and I think she or she means, he expects to spend about $10,000 a month probably in disposable income. I don't know exactly what she means here, but she's talking about how much more it takes to live, and if he wants to have a place to park his car in New York, it's $400 a month. If he's in Miami, it's a $25 a year permit. Okay, talking about the congestion, the daily commute in Manhattan, and how much that adds to his expenses, and things like that. Talking about how costs compare between places like Miami and New York. So it illustrates federalism because um, Florida and New York are both sovereign states, and they can decide for themselves the kind of policies they want to pursue. And the leadership and the people of Florida have decided one course of action with respect to taxes and regulations and all that kind of other stuff. And the leadership and the people of New York have chosen a different way. Okay, and the consequence for this writer is that a lot of people are leaving New York because Florida is so much more agreeable place to live for more than just tax reasons. But I would suggest that's probably the number one reason why people are leaving. And what are the consequences here? Now, um, let's see, where are we talking? We're talking about the population growth. Representation in the House is determined by the size of your state. So although New York and Florida will always have two senators, Florida is now bigger than New York and continues to grow while New York declines, and New York may even lose a representative after the 2020 census. That's how representatives are apportioned. Here we go. New York to lose seats in Congress because people are moving out of New York. So this is just a real world contemporary example of how federalism works and why it's relevant to us in our governing system. Okay, defining course concepts. Here are the authors of the textbook. And what I suggest always and everywhere is whenever you're asked to um, explain a course concept, and you will continue to be asked to do this going on through the rest of the course and including your paper, is you always go to the textbook first. When you Google a question like what is federalism, you have no idea if what you're looking at is accurate or reliable. So that's please don't waste your time Googling definitions of basic course concepts. Go to the textbook. Going forward, you're going to be asked to talk about the influence of the media or the influence of public opinion on policy and those types of things. All that kind of stuff is covered in the textbook. and there is no need to go looking around the internet, especially some of these places you find like Wikipedia is not a reliable source, and History.com and Quora and what is that, or any of these websites you find out there are not reliable. Stick with the textbook. Okay. Okay. Why do I keep talking about pi and APA in your feedback? Okay, pie in this case is not something to eat, unfortunately, but it's a way of explaining what you're writing, explaining the course concepts that demonstrates understanding. Okay, and I've given a link here to the Writing Center. I give this link to in the discussion assignment tips and in your rubrics, the feedback I gave you in your rubrics. But what the objective here is to demonstrate understanding in a clear, concise way. And that's what that E means. Explain. The P is point, the I is information, and the E is explain. And a lot of people end their paragraphs with a quote or a statement of fact, and it needs to be explained how that circles back to the point you're trying to make. And so if you are trying to explain how your policy is impacted by federalism, it's not enough to say that the states, it's not enough to invoke the states. You got to explain why this goes back to illustrate your point. And the same thing with the challenges of federalism, the same thing with any concept or any point you want to make. It needs to be explained. And if you want to talk about that more, you don't understand what this means, I'll be happy to help you with that. Now, APA, it means the American Psychological Association. It is the standard by which, or it's the standard we use for formatting the work we do in a course. Okay, and so there are certain rules about citing sources, how to cite them, when to cite them, all that kind of stuff that you should be familiar with. It is not as important, certainly, as understanding the course concepts and explaining them clearly. It's weighted less in your assignments, but nevertheless, it's an expectation. And the classic example I see is listing a source at the bottom of your answer, but not citing it in your answer. Or citing a source in your answer, but then it's not listed in your references. These are the type of things that I recommend you pay attention to. Every point counts. Again, it's not as important as your content knowledge, but it is part of your grade, and it does reflect on your grade. So I hope you find these comments helpful, and again, I'll be happy to discuss anything with you. Just reach out to me.